the Colberts, the Gillettes, the Evans, the Hemmings. That's an extensive invitation because we all continue to live on what has accrued now to over 5,000 acres. This is where the majority of us have been born and grown up and intermarried. And as you may know, that was under the old regime for the majority of that time. And as you well may understand, it's my inheritance from that old regime. And that's what I try to help many people come to understand as they come to visit. You know, our nation did not simply begin from nothing. We inherited. We inherited so much that had been the habits and the customs and the laws of Englishmen. Because no matter where our forebears came from, no matter who we were Englishmen, brought up Englishmen with those manners, habits, and customs. And yes, I hope you are now thinking, well, there's certainly a conflict and contradictory to our founding principles. Yes, but there's our work. There's our work for every successive generation. You cannot change this overnight. A man is a creature of habit and custom. So this is what I endeavor to encourage us to understand and to continue this work, to remind us that we're the first nation in the history of man founded upon principle, not upon monarchy, not upon aristocracy or nobility, royalty, landed gentry, special privilege, mercy. Remember, that's why we fought the war. That's why we shed our blood. It was not easy, and it still is not easy. But it's a great honor, let alone a great responsibility to be an American. And to see so many who are making their way here, perhaps many amongst you now, who are coming here, leaving old monarchies and authoritative totalitarian governments, as the rest of the world, come here and partake of that privilege to be a citizen. And to see, as no doubt you have in many places that you landed, those of us who've already been here for some time. I mean, of course, the natives, red, white, black. That's who we've been, who we continue to be with all of you. It makes it the more diverse as it ought to be because our founding principles are universal. So I hope we can continue to realize that and continue to remind ourselves that we have created a government of, by, and for. Well, that was rather weak. Well, citizens, this is what concerns me, and concerns me greatly. It ought to concern you. You know, the Romans said man is only one generation removed from barbarism.
Right.
That's right.
What is that?
I declare, I hear a
I'm so
nightingale.
sorry.
I have not heard that delightful melody since I was sailing down the Canal de Midi. I can hear it. Nightingales are not indigenous to Virginia, I can tell you
There's something
certainly.
called technology.
Bad stuff. I'll have to make a record of that later.
There's something called
But I
technology.
hope you will remind yourself, as the Romans said, man is only one generation removed from barbarism. It means it only takes one generation to forget. And then you fall backward, and will you be able to make it up again for the ensuing generations? So there's our work, a continuous effort. And that's why, as I have written, freedom is not free. It requires an eternal vigilance, which means simply we cannot expect as Americans to consider we're entitled to the laws of nature and nature's God, because those laws of nature are not solely ours as Americans. They belong to the family of man across the globe. They've not been given to mankind by any government or any ruler. They're given to man by nature and nature's God. So to engage them, we mean simply we must remain vigilant to protect and defend the same for our fellow man. And this may sound a bit contradictory as I stand before you, because I am perhaps the greatest example of the old habits, customs, and laws, and that which I inherited here, and all too soon. If I may diverge for a moment, I'm considered a tall man, 6 feet, nearly 3 inches. I weigh 195 pounds. My father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, stood 6 feet and 5 inches. He weighed upwards of 240 pounds. A man of exceptional physical capacity. And he was born back east, several miles below Richmond, along the James River, and that was where my grandparents, great-grandparents, were born and grew up. They say their father married well. My mother was Jane Randolph. I don't know whether you've heard the name, but They say the Randolphs are related to nearly every family that continues to refer to itself as gentry in Virginia. Considered the Adam and Eve of that gentry in Virginia. That they have a pedigree going all the way back through England, ultimately to Scotland, related to Robert the Bruce. Well, perhaps you've read as I have written. You all are free to ascribe merit to that if you so choose. We were brought up with a respect for meritocracy, not aristocracy. And how well we saw that, because our parents were amongst the first 3 or 4 settlers out in this wilderness. They staked a claim at Shadwell Farm, right there along the 3 Chop Road. It was named for the little village east of London, where my mother was baptized. So we saw so many making their way along that main artery of commerce and migration, taking that risk to come here and to have a better life for their own family. And back to my inheritance. Our family was a freeholding family, which meant they owned outright their property, and that means not only the real estate, but all of the families living thereupon. And it came to me all too soon, because my father was only 49 years old when he passed away in 1757, leaving my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. I was the eldest son, and I was only 14 years old. Well, thank heaven, gentlemen, many of you understand coming to the aid of orphans and widows. And so many did, many of them executors of my father's estate, making certain that the monies he provided would allow me an education. What a privilege, because I was coming into great holdings. Already you may well understand that this is how aristocracy begins. Oh, it's the British method. The laws secure it very early on. The continual inheritance of freeholders' property from one generation to the next through the eldest son, as the property continues to accumulate more and more. And if there is no male heir, well, then it's held in entail, meaning it's held until the next most immediate male heir. Well, this is something that I was well aware of growing up, that we all realized was somewhat contradictory to our founding principles. And perhaps some of you know, when I was elected the second elected governor of our new Commonwealth of Virginia, along with several others, we wrote up 126 revisals to the monarchical code of law under which we were born and grew up. Bill 82, I remain rather proud of. That's the bill for religious freedom. And it was argued and debated a good 7 years before finally, it was rectified and passed. In essence, it protects and defends the liberty of one's own mind. But Bill 21 is the reference. That was the bill to dissolve primogeniture and entail. It was argued only 1 year before it passed. Imagine, I benefited from it. My younger brothers could not inherit. Sisters could not inherit unless they were married. Then the property went as part of their dower rights to be owned by the husband. It passed because it's common sense. There will always be more younger sons than the eldest son. Now, gentlemen, this you may know is only in probate, that if an individual dies intestate, then there's an equal distribution of property within that family. But you're still free to write your last will and testament as you choose. We're still working on many others of these revisals to the monarchical code, even now. And this is what I share with folks who come a visiting, more coming out into this wilderness than I've known before, particularly this year 21. It is the year 21, is it not? 1821. He's not here in 1721. I'm not going to live to see 1921. So many people coming out here to visit want to know what it was like. And this is what I've been sharing with you now. And remind folks, in case you do not know yourself, there are only 4 of us left. Anyone know what I mean when I say only 4 of us left? Founding fathers. I hear that more and more often. Founding father. How quaint. Founding fathers. Well, citizens, I hope you do not forget, every generation of Americans has its founding fathers. How many here today? This is just common sense. As I have written, the earth belongs to the living generation. I've written that, but the Romans knew it. The laws of usufruct. We have the use of this globe while we're here. The dead hold no power over us. This is ours. And think as well, elements of common sense, no one has ever lived in the past. So every generation has its founding fathers. Welcome, as I speak to you from what I recall and can reassure you. No, when I say only 4 of us, I mean more precisely, there are only 4 of the original 56 signers of our Declaration of American Independence. Anyone know who they are in Massachusetts? John Adams, very good. In New York, he lives along the south shore of Long Island. Hamilton. Never ever forget, if you forget anything else, General Alexander Hamilton had nothing to do with our Declaration of America. He may have been there at the Constitutional Convention. I was not able to be there at the Constitutional Convention. I was in France at the time, so I completely missed the 80s. Wasn't there in 76? You know, it's not Hamilton. Anyone know in New York? No? No, he was from Massachusetts.
Ben Franklin?
No, his name is William Floyd. William Floyd in New York. In Maryland, the only Catholic who signed our Declaration. Charles Carroll. Charles Carroll. And in Virginia. In Virginia. In Virginia. Thank you. Took a bit long. So, citizens, I can assure you that all of us are writing with one and the other. We're writing for the future. To remind ourselves that we accomplished something that England never ever wanted to have happen. Anyone know what that is? This is before I wrote the Declaration, before we declared independence, before the war began. Anyone know? Please do not forget this. This is so essential. No, the taxes weren't much, madam. No one will ever argue they were minuscule taxes. And the fact is that they were extracting support from us in order to encourage a monopoly in the trade of one key company over any other. No?
India.
No?
Religious freedom.
Pardon me?
Religious freedom.
No, even before that.
They
Citizens
don't want an
never
aristocracy anymore.
Pardon me?
They don't want an aristocracy or a monarchy.
Well, no. They could preserve their own and those here who remained loyal, because what we showed them, we could bring together 13 individual nations. Now, how did we do that? How do we do that? Remember, each one of those former colonies, distant, disparate, one from the other, the degree of religious opinion in one versus a vast difference in the other, the degree of freeholders living in one versus the greater number of tenants living upon the freeholdings in the other. There was slavery in every single one of them.
The federal system?
Pardon me?
The federal system?
No, there was no federal system. There was no federal system. England wanted to keep us apart, arguing and bickering amongst ourselves. Why?
We wouldn't be
Exactly. It kept her in control. 4,000 miles away, it kept her in control. This is an element of common sense, not the ultimate for the public good, but read your Machiavelli. Divide and conquer. You certainly know that. But never ever forget the greater common sense. Citizens, never forget it. That's who we prove we are to the rest of the world. 2 heads are better than 1. 3 heads, that's why you're here. 3 heads better than 2. 13 heads collectively will always be better for the common safety, the common defense, but most importantly, the common good. Everyone ultimately benefits. That's how you begin to rectify your differences and the great conflicts and concerns that you all have. You need a starting point. You need to begin. And so this is what we're writing about to one and the other. Then, of course, citizens, we hope the future will read it. So here's the most remarkably unrecorded moment in our nation's history that we may be all together. And as you've been kind to allow me the floor, for the short time we have left, the floor is yours. So I'm happy to hear whatever's been on your mind these last several centuries. Citizens, this is your time. Yes?
Where can we see some of the original rough drafts of the Declaration of Independence?
Well, some of the original drafts. Well, of course, I wrote the first draft.
That's what I wrote.
Well, I'll tell you right now, ma'am, that and a few halfpennies will not even get you tomorrow's paper, as far as I know this year. But I have a copy inside the house, and then there was a second draft that was originally given to me by Dr. Franklin on his deathbed. That was in April 1790 when I visited him in Philadelphia on my way to New York. However, as he asked me to hold that in safekeeping several years later, I was visited by his grandson, Temple Franklin, living in England. And of course, he understood that his grandfather had given me the contents of his bed table drawer, which he pressed on me was rightfully his. Now, I do not want to get into any disparaging of an individual, their reputation, but his lineage is questioned. However, it is well known he is his grandson, and so therefore I was obligated by the blood to turn that over to him. I have no idea where that's gone. There are some other drafts that were shared, particularly as President Hancock of the Congress had a draft. He had to, as he served ex officio. Remember, he appointed 5 of us to that committee to draft the Declaration. But that did not mean it was a fait accompli, because we had to first argue and debate the resolution of Virginia for independence, which fortunately occurred on the 2nd of July. That's the true birthday of our nation. The day that John Adams has always said we should remember each year with masked bands, bonfires, parades, and illumination. But for whatever reason, we increasingly recognize the day we voted on our Declaration as somewhat the birthday. And that, of course, had to first witness 2 days of a great argument and debate as to how we wanted the rest of the world to understand what we were doing. And so that is why certain drafts were altered and changed. Before we had the one that was officially printed in the Pennsylvania Gazette that next morning, July the 5th, and the one that was formally engrossed by Timothy Matlack in Philadelphia that we all signed for most.
Do you regret having Aaron Burr for vice president after shutting?
Do I regret having Aaron Burr as my vice president? Well, for those who may be curious about this, you may recall that at that time in the presidential election in 1800, this was the second time that I was invited to stand for that office. The first, of course, was when His Excellency President Washington let it be known that he would not stand for a second term. And we certainly bore witness then that politics, just like nature, have halls of vacuum. All factions began to implode. Who would be the successor? Of course, the Federalists wanted to have a hold on the government, believed whoever who was ever vice president should be the successor. Well, I don't know how many of you are of that particular opinion, but of course there quite naturally is an opposite opinion, and thank heaven for our nation that we entertain that. There's never been another nation in the history of man that allows so freely one to express their opinion and to argue and debate and critique that opinion. And then, what brought 13 individual nations together? Never forget the founding principle of compromise and resolution. And so it was that I was invited to come out of my retirement here and stand opposed to Vice President Adams. I lost because it was originally written in our Constitution, whoever receives the second highest number of votes becomes vice president. Now, I'm going to tell you, dear, if there were ever a fault in our Constitution, that is the most obvious. You could never expect that two people having differences of opinion, arguing freely, arguing and debating, and one succumbs should then ally with the other. No, that's not possible so much in human nature. It's certainly a virtue. General Washington believed so, but not in the nature of man. And remember, citizens, never forget this. It's not the purpose of government to change human nature. That's futile. It's never going to happen. It's the purpose of government to learn how to work with it for the common good. So, unfortunately, as vice president, I was not very silent. I offered my opinions freely, contrary to my own president. Didn't like the growing deficit of spending in our government. Didn't like the influence of the National Bank on holding closely the purse strings, if you will, to the counting houses. Did not like our treatment of our former ally, France. So by the next presidential election, 1800, all of the aforementioned arguments were festering throughout our nation. In fact, we were almost splitting asunder. New England thought it might be time to secede. And therefore, there were 4 candidates for that office of president. Some say 2 were vice presidential candidates. No such stand or nomination. And good Lord, that was the year 1800. We were moving our government from Philadelphia down to Washington. The federal city is yet incompleted. But anyone who bore witness to it will never forget the name-calling, the vitriol, the hatred hurled against all of the candidates, the twistifications of the facts printed by the newspapers. Thank heaven we'll never see anything like it again. But the important thing, citizens, the important thing to remember, we survived. We survived because we're the unique breed of the American people. That's why the eyes of the world are upon us, citizens. That's why, because you all have left to come here. In your hands remains that strength of the very delicate fiber of a democratical republic. I can't encourage you more to uphold that for our future generations. That's why we survived. And though I received the popular vote, don't get me started on the electoral system. And that fell into a mess. It fell into a tie, 73 electoral votes each for Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. And for many days, our nation did not know who would be the next president. Can you ever imagine that happening in our history? And this year, 21, well, it was only 21 years ago, was it not? So we waited it out, sir, and I wrote during that time that if the choice would be, in the breaking of that tie, Aaron Burr as our 3rd president. Of course, we had become known as anti-federalist, democratical Republicans, or simply Jeffersonian Republicans by that point. Not that I favor any one of those titles. I simply have said, let us be known as the spirit of 76. That we will not forget those founding principles for the benefit of all. But I said that all good Republicans would come together and welcome President-elect Aaron Burr. So you all may know, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but I received a letter right here from our Secretary of the Treasury. And I'll never forget the first sentence. Dear Mr. Vice President, I consider you the least dangerous of the 2 candidates. That's exactly what he wrote. And he offered me a compromise. There we are again. That's who we are. Compromise. He said, I will influence the outturn of the electoral vote if you may promise me, turned in your direction, that after your inauguration you will not cast out of office all Federalists, but proceed in an equilibrium of political influence and recognition. Well, of course I could live it. That's who we are. You never dance the other side and completely endeavor to squelch it. No, we have to continue to provide that energy for our nation. So I accepted this compromise, and well, on the 17th of February, 1801, the tie was broken, and I was elected the 3rd president. Wow. And thereby, Colonel Aaron Burr became my vice president. Now, 3 years later, in the campaign of 1804, we welcomed the 12th Amendment, which enabled that election to be the first vice presidential election. Burr was welcome and invited to stand for it, but he wouldn't take it. He wouldn't take it. He would not stand for vice president, and we welcomed then the longest-serving governor of the state of New York.
Madison?
No, from New York. His name is Clinton. George Clinton.
Yeah.
So now Burr, of course, then began to walk down the pathway of certain political chicanery. I don't want to have to get into that, but I think you all know what he endeavored to do. And of course, I learned about this early as president. for the individual with whom he was collaborating, and then suddenly discovered, oh, this is not going to happen, I better get out of this. And so he sent me all the information that was absolute evidence to what Colonel Burr and he were trying to do. And of course, as Burr was captured at Blennerhassett Island and brought to stand for free trial, they wanted me to bear witness. I could not do it. I claimed executive privilege. I could not do it because, would anyone know? Remember with whom he was collaborating? It would have been the most awful embarrassment for our nation in the sight of the world. The general of our armies, James Wilkerson, the general of our armies, who we learned was on the payroll of the Kingdom of Spain. If you can cite another example of high treason, I'd like to hear that. So there you are, and I beg pardon, you asked me a very simple question, and that was the short answer. Citizens, if you have a question?
He does,
Oh,
sir.
yes, sir.
How long did it take you to write the Declaration of Independence?
The Declaration, I remember vividly. I share with so many people here. It took me 3 days to write it on 4 sheets of paper. I began on the 12th of June. And why do you think it took me so long? Any idea?
Because it's like so long.
Well, no, there's nothing new or original in our Declaration. I've said that. I never came up with something new or original. I've written that many. In fact, I've written, I am no genius. Everything in the Declaration has all been written, argued, debated. You may find it in what I call the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon, Sidney, John Locke, those influential from time immemorial in man's eternal struggle for liberty. Those authors, I'm sure you and everyone else here have read and reread frequently, do you not?
Absolutely.
No, you do not. I know you do. Not when you remember in 1776, many Americans could not even read. So when I was invited to take up the pen, I realized I had to write something that could be publicly read. I had to shed the lofty sophisms of these ancient authors, explain it, write it in clear and simple terms as an expression of the American mind. And place, but let me answer this one here. To place before the world the common sense of the matter. And that is simply that our American Revolution is fought on behalf of the common man, to provide the greatest good for the greatest number. And to show the rest of the world, as so many people coming here have understood, that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred ready to ride them, but that man holds an inalienable right in nature to burst forth from the monkish chains of ignorance and hold the reins of self-government. When you see the great contradiction that is still with us, who knows better? But I keep saying, that Declaration applies to you all. It applies to all of us. And that remains our work. So no, it flowed easily from my mother wit, but I make mistakes. Is it easy to erase ink? So I would have to cross out the mistakes, write the correction above or beneath. At the end of the day, I could hardly read my own jottings. So that evening, I'd transcribe all of that clearly, and then the next day, I'd make more mistakes. So that's why it took a good 3 days before it went to the other members on that committee, the other 4 members. Just very last one, and very quickly. Yes, sir.
How long did it take to Americans to be free? Like, how long?
We're still working on it. We're still working. You know that. We're still working. That's your work. That's your work. That's what we work towards. You know, remember this. Last year, we had a presidential election, did we not? President Monroe was standing for re-election. And this is at the time we admitted our 23rd state, the north of Massachusetts, they call it the Maine.